Mia Gloria Fides. That is the Rockingham family motto, meaning faith is my glory. And it stands tall and proud above the Corinthian portico right behind me, here at Wentworth Woodhouse. But Rockingham is a tiny village and a castle 100 miles away here, but we're standing in Wentworth in South Yorkshire. So what links a small Yorkshire village and an even smaller Northamptonshire town? Well, new research has found that the families that resided here and the wider communities have links all across the country to even the most unexpected of places. More than that though, new research has also indicated that it has links across the globe to small villages in Central America, all the way to Africa and Asia. This documentary is our way of trying to challenge the preconceived notion that whilst this was a cornerstone of the local community, it also plays a wider and huge part of a global community. Research that has been discovered finds connections from Wentworth to all across the country, including Malton, Yorkshire, Northamptonshire, but beyond the borders of England. It's also found links to Ireland, Australia, a small island called the Cocos Island in Central America, the USA itself, Africa, Asia, and even Australia. The connection this small Yorkshire village has and this grand house has to the tiny village of Rockingham is owed to the builder and owner of this house, Thomas Watson Wentworth, the first Marquess of Rockingham. His father, who was of the Watson family lineage, was a descendant of one of the first owners of Rockingham Castle, which is there at the village of Rockingham. He passed the title of Baron down through his lineage to Thomas Watson Wentworth, of Baron of Rockingham, and thus in the 1740s, when he was christened a Marquess by the King, Thomas Watson Wentworth was actually christened as a Marquess of Rockingham because of that Rockingham Castle lineage. But they also had a connection beyond just England itself within the UK. They had a lot of land in Ireland. However, this is a heritage connection that has been a bit fraught with controversy, to be honest. Now, one of the original owners of the house, before it looked like this, was Thomas Wentworth, the first Earl of Strafford. He was Deputy of Ireland from 1632 until about 1639-1640. However, his rule there has been described as one with a firm hand and a strongly authoritarian rule. Ultimately, in Ireland, his rule targeted Catholics, as he wanted to make Ireland a unanimously Protestant and prosperous nation, and thus a lot of Catholics suffered during his reign. However, a lot of scholars, more modern scholars, particularly English ones, do say though that it was a rather successful one in terms of its outcomes, as they actually did triple custom revenues of Ireland, and they did in fact make it prosperous. Of course, fast forward a few hundred years until the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam, when the Fitzwilliams owned the house, and they still had that land in Ireland and across Yorkshire. In fact, the 4th Earl Fitzwilliam, by his death, had over 115,000 there and thereabouts acres of land, some of which were in Ireland. However, it has been said that the Fitzwilliams were quite good landowners and quite good to their staff. Nevertheless, the connection between Wentworth and Ireland has always seen the starting of one as a quite difficult and firm-handed beginnings. But this small village in South Yorkshire also has connections to Central America. Landed gentry and rich families were kind of obsessed with exploring the world, and the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam, who resided here in the early 1900s, was no different. He is described as being a bit of a little adventurer, and in 1904 he and a few others went on an expedition to the very tiny, very remote Cocos Islands in Central America. Now, they went there in search of supposed buried treasure, and whilst they never really found what they were looking for, what the 7th Earl Fitzwilliam did actually get was a near-death experience, as he was very, very close to one of the mining operations, to one of the exploring techniques that they used, which was exploding dynamite to try and destroy the local surroundings to find what they wanted. He did survive, but it does show that small villages and even big stately homes like this and the families that resided there have connections all across the globe, even to unsuspecting tiny islands like the Cocos Islands. But speaking of America, the families here at Wentworth Woodhouse also have a connection to the USA. Charles Watson Wentworth, the first Prime Minister from Yorkshire who resided here, was an avid supporter of the colonies and didn't really like the way they were treated. In 1765, he helped repeal the Stamp Act to try and lessen the burden they paid in taxes. For his support, they actually named a county in America called Rockingham in his honour. They also have a town called Wentworth that was also named after him too. But the wider community of Rotherham in general was also quite sympathetic to the colony's treatment. The nearby Thomas Howard, the 3rd Earl of Effingham, was a neutralist and he didn't support nor go against the colonies, but he too voiced how he disliked how they were being treated. And for his support, they actually named a city in Illinois called Effingham in his honour. And he also named his hunting lodge Boston Castle, after the Boston Tea Party, to show that they did have his continuing support. It's very interesting to see that centuries later, these small villages in South Yorkshire really do still have a living connection to America. So new research has found connections between Wentworth Woodhouse and the families that resided here and the local community, and America, Central America, Ireland and the rest of England. But new research carried out by other researchers has also found connections to Africa, Asia, Australia and more. And we're here today to go and talk to them and find out what they've learned.
Well, I was particularly interested in Charles Watson Wentworth. He was Prime Minister in 1765 for 1 year, and then again in 1782 for 6 months, shortly before he passed away. And so, because he was PM at that time, I was particularly interested in finding out the links he had with the East India Company and the South Asia. It was a private company, it was a commercial company really, but it kind of over a period of time the government had more and more say in how it was run. And this is what was quite significant with Charles Wentworth, because he was PM at a time when the government was trying to basically get a bit more of the action. So they were kind of, you know, the company was making lots of money. There was lots of corruption going on as well. I found some political kind of papers in terms of letters from the company into to Charles Wentworth, you know, going back and forth. I mean, for example, he did have a holding. He did have stocks in the East India Company, not very many stocks, but that's one of the things I was looking at to find, you know, whether, you know, in terms of the wealth that Wentworth would have, whether that came from, for example, the East India Company in any way. So I think we can say that didn't really happen in a significant way. For example, at Wentworth Woodhouse, so there was this idea of how did these plants actually get here? I mean, you have to remember that at the time, you know, in the 18th century, it would take a year for ships to kind of actually travel all the way here. So anything that you were kind of exporting, it would take quite a long time. Um, and we, in the archives, I found a specific letter from Bahania Gardens in Calcutta. And this was a botanic gardens in Calcutta that had sent a parcel of seeds um, to Charles Watson Wentworth, to kind of Wentworth Woodhouse. And so this was quite significant because we can trace the fact that with this one letter and this parcel of seeds, obviously it proves one way of seeds arriving here. So if that's, you know, we can, this allows us to kind of look for more evidence in terms of you know, how other plants and seeds might have. So Nathaniel Wallish was superintendent of the Calcutta Botanic Gardens, and he was held this position from 1815 to 1846, so about more than 30 years. And this was a really important position to hold. It was like the most important botanical position, if you like, in the East India Company. And so we know that he actually sent plants and seeds all across the world. I mean, he distributed them across India as well. So there was this idea of botanical kind of elements kind of improving people. I mean, much the way that museums kind of improved kind of the ordinary person, there was this idea of kind of in civil society you would kind of distribute these plants. So he did that. He also distributed them to universities and various people studying. And then also he actually distributed them to elites. So to one of the themes that they're looking at is tea, and the whole idea of tea is something that's universal and drunk, you know, all across the world. And you know, it starts from this kind of camellia plant, and it starts in China. And I think these are really lovely kind of themes to look at, and in terms of you know, it's something that connects everyone really. But I think what we shouldn't forget is that the politics behind it, and I think we can actually use something even as duplicitous as tea to look at the colonial connections, and to look at how this arrived in this. I don't think we should forget, you know, the colonial violence and the labor that was extracted, and the products that were extracted from India. And I think this kind of research allows us to look at that. So whilst I think we should look at the themes that are you know, that bind us today, we shouldn't forget about the difficult history, and we shouldn't kind of shy away from addressing that, because I think you know, people can face up to that. It's not wagging a finger at anyone, because we're living in contemporary times. You know, it's just a way of addressing that this history exists.
I'm the author of two books on the romance of Jane Austen and Darcy Wentworth. They're based on the history of their lives and their times in Britain, and Darcy's time in Australia, where he made a significant contribution to the establishment of the colony of New South Wales. I'm one of the 6 generations of Australian Wentworths. Darcy Wentworth was my 3 times great-grandfather. My mother, Mary Wentworth, spent several years at school in St Swithun's in Winchester. Her father was born in Merley House in Winbourne in Dorset, and yet we're 6 generations Australian. Darcy Wentworth was born in Portadown in Ireland. He was a part of a family that had migrated at the time of the battle of the Boyne, I suppose, to Ireland. But they had also some of the Wentworths had moved to America and moved to Ireland as a consequence of the beheading of the Earl of Strafford, because they feared for their own lives too, and that was a cause for some. And there was Wentworths in Hampshire and in parts of America, but also they came. Obviously, they went he was born in Ireland as a consequence of them going to Ireland. He was trained as Darcy was trained as a surgeon in Ireland, and he served as an ensign in the Ulster Volunteers during the time of the American Revolution. But en route to London, he stayed with his cousin Earl Fitzwilliam at Wentworth Woodhouse, and that was in 1875. And he also stayed in York with Robert Sinclair, who was a loyal Whig supporter of Fitzwilliam, who introduced him to Darcy to many of the leading Whig supporters in York. Fitzwilliam remained a loyal friend and a cousin and a patron for Darcy throughout his life. Their correspondence over the years was placed in Wentworth, in the Wentworth Monuments in Sheffield archive by Earl Fitzwilliam, and they're all there today. You can go and read all their letters that they wrote between themselves. I'll tell you about Jane Austen's connection with Wentworth Woodhouse too, now that we've talked about Darcy's connection. In summer of 1789, Jane and Darcy were asked to take tea at Grosvenor Square. Fitzwilliam invited them to attend the grand occasion he was organising at Wentworth Woodhouse in September to welcome the Prince of Wales and the royal tour of the North. Jane gained permission from her mother and her father, and they were delighted by the invitation. Jane was in London staying with her cousin, the Comtesse de Fluide, Eliza, the Comtesse de Fluide, in August 1789, when she and Darcy left by carriage for Rotherham to attend a party. Fitzwilliam organised for them to their transport to Wentworth Woodhouse. In Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen celebrated her enduring romance with Darcy. This is part of the story. Their elopement to Scotland came after they'd visited Wentworth Woodhouse. Fitzwilliam was the successor to the fortunes of the Fitzwilliams and the Wentworths and the Watsons and all. After Rockingham, the Prime Minister died, the estate of Wentworth Woodhouse went to the Fitzwilliams, but Darcy's family were distant cousins. They were a branch of the family that had originated in South Emshall in Yorkshire.
So I actually haven't been able to find them directly benefiting. So they definitely were not plantation owners. They didn't own any slaves. I've gone through, UCL have a really extensive legacies of slavery database when once all the plantation owners were filing for compensation, that's where you can find a lot of slave owners' names, and they're not cropping up on that system, which is a positive thing. But on the flip side, they were definitely benefiting from the exploitation of African people and the whole entirety of the transatlantic slave. I didn't find that Charles Watson Wentworth was particularly vocal in his opposition to slavery at the time. He definitely wasn't pro-slavery, but as I said, he wasn't particularly vocal. He did position himself on the side of the abolitionists at the time, but it wouldn't be until 1788 when the first Slave Trade Act was eventually passed. Obviously, he became PM in 1765, so there's a good 20 years worth of work where not really much was happening. And again, I didn't find him particularly involved in the cause. It was his next descendant, William Fitzwilliam. He was involved in the 1807 Yorkshire elections, which William Wilberforce was also running in, and obviously that name today is synonymous with the abolition of slavery. And in Yorkshire, William Wilberforce was kind of a poster boy. He was kind of looked at as a new kind of politician. Obviously, he wasn't like the Wentworth family, coming from decades before and from money, and it seemed that the locals really got on side with Wilberforce, and I kind of saw Fitzwilliam as kind of following in his footsteps almost. So as I described it, they were abolitionists, but they weren't really heavily campaigning against. The Wentworths were really keen to be involved in the latest trends of the time, something that we could equally be accused of today. Having the latest mobile phone or the latest clothes, people not getting paid very well. So there's things like sugar, chocolate, the consumption of tea and coffee. All of these things would have been grown by African people at some point. And then you also have the trade in plants and animals. So there's quite an extensive record of animals being shipped over from Africa, which would have been housed in Wentworth. Things like a chimpanzee, they were dressing up and giving port wine to. So obviously that wasn't the best care of an animal at the time. And again, it was very much to show off and show how cultured you were at the time, bringing your friends around your garden and saying, look at all these exotic birds and creatures that I have. The pineapple, which has been quite a favourite of mine during this research. So the pineapple would have originated in South America, but the Europeans would have largely first come across it being cultivated in the Caribbean. So again, highly likely that it would have been being grown by enslaved African people. And then you had this trend of naturalists at the time coming over, taking samples of plants and obviously seeds and cuttings, and then taking that back to Europe. And it would have been the enslaved people introducing them to these plants again, and pretty much showing them what they were and how to grow them and keep them. And this is where the pineapple was picked up in the Caribbean, taken over to Europe, and became, basically they called it pineapple fever. They were growing so many pineapples at Wentworth Woodhouse at one time. At one point they were growing 16 per day. And they were so popular that they would end up renting them because it just became such a status. So one quite strong link, I would say, is a Henry Friday. He was first mentioned in a PhD thesis back in the 80s. So he was recorded as being a servant, a black boy servant, he's described as in the record books at Wentworth. This was in 1770. I did a little bit more digging and I managed to find his baptism records, which was in 1768, and he was baptized in the village of Wentworth. Going a little bit further with that, it seemed again that it was a massive trend of the aristocrats to have black servants, because again it showed off how cultural they were, that they were in touch with the African continent. So if again you could show off to your friends, look, I have a black servant, that was something quite trendy at the time. But it does seem that these these servants would have been youngsters. Henry Friday may well have been 10 years old when he was brought over.
Volunteers and consultants have been also exploring the archives and contributing their research to build a greater understanding of how goods came to arrive at Wentworth Woodhouse, and to set the context for family and political life in the 18th and 19th centuries at the house. This includes the importation of tea, exotic animals, and camellias.
Because we've discovered that the camellia house stored has actually got camellias that it wasn't known had travelled to England, and at a very early date. We don't yet know what part in the early 18th century they arrived here, but from camellia you make tea. Now it's quite possible the ones we've got at Wentworth are more the decorative species rather than the tea producing species, because when they were being imported particularly from China and Japan, they didn't want to lose their monopoly on production, so they weren't going to allow it to happen elsewhere. But the fact Wentworth has got camellias at a very early part in the 18th century, and there's other evidence which shows this interest in new goods, new commodities, far beyond just consuming them. Well, where did they come from? How were they prepared? What's the rituals? What does it do for you? That's quite significant to Wentworth. And there's a trail through the 18th and 19th centuries of a key interest of various family members at quite a high scientific level with horticulture and new commodities coming in. So the ability to have tea and socialise was very important here, and that was often a feminine activity. And there's lots of cartoons of the time where male satirists, George Cruikshanks for example, Jonathan Swift, were taking against women gathering together, drinking tea in the afternoon in their own homes, because they'd talk, they'd gossip. You know, it would be scandalous. We're not too sure about this. In the early 18th century, the main tea that came in was green tea. And there were different categories. There were two types. There was black tea, green tea. Black tea had a generic term called Buhia, and there was Congo tea. And then for the green teas, there was Dutch, there was hyssop. There were all sorts of different types. A lot of it depended on who was getting it, whether it was the Dutch East Indies or the English East Indian Company. They were going out to China. They thought they could monopolise it. They didn't quite realise how big China was, I don't think. And they both went out there thinking, if we buy all the tea, we've got the monopoly in Europe. Tea was imported from China, from Japan, came to England, and then it went to America, and that caused a lot of annoyance because we taxed it. The Dutch were undercutting us, so black market set up there of buying tea without taxation. We then reduced the taxes on tea, but didn't abolish them. That's what actually generated the Boston Tea Party in 1773, and that famous phrase, no taxation without representation. And you got what was the equivalent of about $1 million worth of tea dumped into Boston Harbour. It was a big thing at the time. What a lot of people don't know is that also it generated an embargo on drinking tea. People in America said, right, if they're going to tax it, we won't consume it. And there are comments saying you would not believe how the use of tea has just dropped so phenomenally in America because they were protesting against the taxation on it. We use the term boycott. The word boycott hadn't been invented in the 19th century, but that's exactly in the 18th century. But that's really what they were doing. And that's interesting because people in England were becoming aware of how sugar was being produced with the slave trades in America, and were beginning to get very uncomfortable about that. So after the Boston Tea Party, the late 1770s, there was a boycott in England of sugar to protest against the conditions and slave trade. It didn't work as well as the one in America, purely because at the time it was gaining ground in England, and houses such as Wentworth, down to middling sorts, were saying, no, will go without sugar. They got black tea coming in by that time, and that wasn't as bitter as green tea, and so they could say, we can do without sugar, we'll just put milk in it. But the French lost their sugar plantations due to riots in Haiti, and so they just switched the English production to France, and so as a boycott it didn't work as well as the tea boycott in America did. But it shows this growing awareness. By the third quarter of the 18th century, people in England were becoming uncomfortable when they were realising how these commodities they were consuming were being produced.
When we started looking in the archives, we realised that as well as fantastic gardens and kitchen gardens, they also had a menagerie. The menagerie was in front of what's now the Camellia House, and in front of what's the tea house facing in the opposite direction and to the west. So it was quite vast. We looked, my husband and I, in some more documents in the archives called the household accounts, and they were done annually. And in every one of them, there are pages about the garden and the menagerie. Going through those, we realised just what fantastic animals they'd had. So from, for instance, the 1770s, they had a moose. And of course, in the 19th century, they had buffalo, they had bison, as well as cattle and deer grazing in the parkland. And some buffalo escaped, but that's another story. But going back to sort of the birds, I think we counted 62 species of different birds that they had. An amazing number. So they had hawks, they had owls, they had parrots, macaws, they had waterfowl, including black swans, which are from Australia. Just everything almost, you can imagine. Songbirds, because that was quite nice as you were walking around your gardens to hear the songbirds. So that was something quite special. And then there's another account, I think it's 1788, of a Michael Bisbee, who was the butcher in Wentworth, and he was being paid for bringing sheep's heads and hearts to feed the golden eagle. There are records of a brown bear from America. They had ostrich, they had emus, they had armadillos, you name it. They had an ocelot, which is a wild cat. They even had a kangaroo with a joey in its pouch, and llamas. Now the llamas were brought from Arica in Chile and brought over here in the 1830s and 40s. And in the Rotherham Gazette, I think it's 1849, there's an account and it said something like, an extraordinary birth at Wentworth Woodhouse. And it said, the noble Earl Fitzwilliam, who is in possession of a female and male llama, and the female had given birth to a young one. And it said it was perfectly white and healthy in appearance. And you just hope that this poor creature survived, because sadly, a few years later, Charles Cooper was being paid for cleaning and mounting the skeleton of a llama. It was the Sheffield Daily Telegraph in 1873. There's a report of Earl Fitzwilliam inviting his miners, his colliers, to come for the day and to enjoy a stroll round the gardens and the grounds, and to visit the menagerie and the museum. And it's wonderfully written. It said that they were shown round by a genial old lady who pointed out the ostrich, the emu, the armadillo, the orangutan, and the chimpanzee. And she said the chimpanzee was being fed on port wine and biscuits. From talking to people locally when we've been doing books or articles, certainly the local population, by and large, have a great affection for the house and the families who've been here, because the families throughout the centuries, and certainly from the 18th century onwards, were very well regarded for the care that they gave to their tenants and to, you know, anyone who was working in their coal mines, in their ironworks, in the glassworks, you know, the potteries, whatever it might be.
But there's also quite a lot that's still to find out. So, for example, we know from the Camellia Society that the camellias are really old, probably a couple of 100 years old. So what I've been trying to do is delve into the archive and can I find references in letters from, for example, a second Marchioness about planting the camellias or camellias being in the gardens, or from then the Lord Milton, as he was before he inherited the estate. And it's been really interesting because it's been fascinating. Several generations of the family were really avid plant collectors, but so far I have not yet been able to find a specific mention of camellias. So that's one of the kind of exciting things about the research. I think we've just started, and we know that these camellias are really significant, and that the family were really significant plant collectors, collecting plants from all over the world. But there's still a lot more to find out. So it's exciting. They were definitely importing and growing plants from all over the world. So, for example, for a time, they were very famous for their collection of orchids. And orchids are a big plant family and come from all over the world. But also ferns. So I have found reference to plants from South America, from the Caribbean, as well as obviously the camellias, which are originally from China. Yeah, there's plenty of connections. I think at the moment we're just sort of scratching the surface of those. So my main role has actually just been kind of to research those stories and to work out how we can tell them in a way that's really engaging, and that sort of captures people's imagination and makes them want to find out more about the history of the Camellia House and the people who lived and worked there.
Brilliant. What future, or what the plans for the Camellia House moving forward?
As far as my work is concerned, I think so. The end goal is to interpret or tell the story of the Camellia House. So that's going to mean researching and designing the exhibits in detail. I know that the architects will obviously be restoring it so that it's back to its former glory. And the gardeners at Wentworth will be carefully looking after the camellias and ensuring they're back to sort of prime health, because it's been quite neglected over a number of years. And yeah, so I guess it's just to sort of bring the place back to life.
Research is helping Wentworth Woodhouse to prepare their strategies for regenerating the Camellia House, connecting South Yorkshire communities and making history a part of its new life.
The camellias then, they played an important role with the tea, and that role in the tea trade, where does that place Wentworth Woodhouse in regard to its place on the international stage?
I think it's really important to understand that the camellias that we have in the Camellia House at the moment we only know 4 species of the ones we have, and we're still trying to identify the other 15 or so plants that are there. And we don't at the moment think that they are necessarily tea camellias, because obviously there's 2 kinds of camellias. There's the sort of ornamental camellias, and then there's those that produce tea. But I think that we don't know that, and that's going to be a really exciting part of this project, is to really understand what we've got there. We certainly know they're really significant, and they're one of the most significant collections in the Western world at the moment. So, but I do think that the whole I think tea is such a global thing, and I think the fact that the Fitzwilliam family and the Wentworth connection with tea is really an important and significant factor that allows, certainly in the modern context, allows us to really reach out to all sorts of communities and engage them in what's happening at Wentworth in its modern context. I think looking back in history, there's no question that the family at Wentworth Woodhouse had a global outlook on things, whether that was through the animals they collected, the plants they collected, the tea that they were interested in, you know. So I think that retaining that global...
And I think with these existing connections between that live today in name as well, is there any way, do you think, that we could, or whether Wentworth Woodhouse could connect or reach out or form some sort of project that could, you know, reach out to them and get the heritage involved with these connections with these international communities?
Definitely, and we're really keen to do that. We're already we've already made some fairly extensive connections over in the US with the Wentworth connections over there, which is really important to us. And I think there is absolutely the potential for a global project. And I think one of the really exciting things at the moment is looking at how we take that global history, and particularly in the 21st century with digital, where it allows us to, our connectivity globally is so much more readily available to us, that I think that potentially we could create a very interesting global project using digital as the basis for making that connection. So I think you'll find that the influence of the Earls Fitzwilliam and the families at Wentworth extends far beyond just Australia and India and America. You know, I'm sure their influence now stretches globally. So I think that there's fantastic potential to do something on a really global scale.
What is the plan now moving forward for the Camellia House?
It's to become a facility for the gardens, but it's going to be a specialty tea house. So we will specialise in teas from across the world, and we will run various community events there so that we understand how people take tea in different communities, not just different from different ethnicities, but different communities, you know, within our own direct sort of landscape, and within our own region and within our own country and globally.
New research has shown that Wentworth Woodhouse had a global reach, and the families that resided there played an important part on the global stage. But the work is not over yet. There is more work to be done at the Camellia House, and there is more outreach to be done with the global communities across the world. New research has shown Wentworth Woodhouse in a new perspective, and with new perspectives come new possibilities.